Welcome to the Renewable Energy and Smart Grid breakout discussion. I have with me today Thomas Mickelson and Alex Mitchell. And I thought maybe perhaps it would be best to start with a round of introductions. So why don't we introduce ourselves and share with the audience a brief introduction of your work and focus in the industry. Go ahead, Thomas.
Right, thanks a lot, Jonathan. Thank you for being here. I am in the industry for more than 20 years, working on the utility side for 10 years, primarily focusing on developing the whole introduction of electricity as a free market product. And then I kind of switch side, work with companies like Panasonic, trying to look at the technology that is needed to become more green, if you could put it that way. And then for the past 7-8 years, I've been working as a consultant and doing research primarily in Europe and in Asia on understanding what does it take to make people change their behavior. So focusing very much on the user aspect of the energy transition.
Terrific. Alex?
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Alex Mitchell. I have spent probably about 15 years approaching in the sustainable mobility space, including a lot of work on electrification of vehicles, battery storage, items like that. And then 4 years ago, I joined Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, which is a nonprofit clean tech incubator, mission of creating an inclusive green economy. We incubate in 3 tech priority spaces, which is zero emissions mobility, clean energy, and circular economy. And obviously, in our mind, so much is merging, if you will, between that sustainable mobility and the clean energy. And my role at Lacey is really overseeing our startup recruiting, the programs we put startups through, as well as the investments we make. We have both a venture capital fund and a debt fund that help our startups, all under the overarching nonprofit mission that we have as an incubator. So a lot of time in transportation, which bled into energy, and now a lot more time focused on the clean energy side.
Great. My name is John Kilberg. I'll be your moderator today. I've been started my career in the thermal generation space, working for the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, helping U.S. companies develop and finance thermal generation projects all around the world, really, and got into renewables in the mid-2000s, initially in wind and later in solar and battery more recently. Here in the US, we develop, construct, and own projects in 13 states. And so my focus is primarily US. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this panel is we really do have a world focus. This really is a global transition to a greener economy. And with that, I'll sort of jump into the first question, which is thinking about renewable energy and green infrastructure. What would you guys say are the greatest challenges slowing the transition to a carbon-free future? And then set the landscape for us, if you will. And we can, Thomas, if you want to go ahead, we can start with you.
Yeah, no, I can definitely start. And I think there is not one answer to this question, but I might start with one that is related to the fact that we have been building quite a robust infrastructure in the US and in Europe, focusing on building this very centralized approach. And what we're seeing with the renewables coming up is that basically the things that we have been designing, the very centralized system is not designed for the uptake of more and more renewables. We see actually all over Europe and probably the same in the US that the DSOs, so the distribution companies, are not really capable of taking up the amount of solar panels or windmills that are actually being projected. So it's a fight to actually be able to build the capacity that is needed for this green transition. So I think new business models, and also seeing that we basically need to maybe build the whole infrastructure in a different way, is something that is definitely on the top 3 priority of my list to answer your question.
Thank you. Alex, do you have a comment?
Yeah, one thing that I observe as I look sort of across the globe is a pretty significant disconnect between, let's call it like COP21 type proclamations, which are global, and then like what's really happening behind the scenes with government support for this transition. For as much, for example, that China is a polluter, it very much got the message, I would argue, well over a decade ago on the importance of the energy transition, whether it be solar manufacturing or the battery economy, and really invested heavily in staying ahead of the curve on the ability to have the R&D and manufacturing, live in China. Europe has gotten that message more recently. And unfortunately, in the US, we have not that same political alignment around, again, despite whatever is said at the COP21 level in terms of signatories, we do not have what we need in the US to really move the needle on this, which is bipartisan support. And the marquee probably marker of that over the last 6 months has been the failure of the Build Back Better bill.
I think you're exactly right. And one of the things that we all discussed prior to the session starting was this idea that renewables in the U.S. has become a partisan issue, and it really isn't. It's an energy security issue, and I think I would hope that what we're seeing with the war in Ukraine is an example. And Thomas, you're over there. You see it firsthand, and perhaps feel it a little more closely than we do here in the States. But having control of your own energy supply is not a partisan issue. It's one of sort of state security.
Yeah.
And the U.S. has not embraced that yet for a whole host of reasons. One of which is that so much of our governance is incredibly local. A COP21 or even a federal mandate is very hard to implement when a guy who's putting a project in the ground has to deal with a local permitting agency. A county, all the way up from a county commissioner up to the state level and then the federal level above that. And that has proven quite hard to do in the sort of partisan world we live in today. It's not a Republican issue. It's not a Democrat issue. It's an issue of energy security and national security. And these projects are economic. I mean, I think that the argument that keeps getting made here in the U.S. is that, oh, you're getting government subsidies and this is a democratic socialization of the energy sector and as a handout, but that's just not the case. And I think China saw that early on, that this could be an engine of their economy. And just as Alex mentioned, it has been. They invested in it and it has been. I think the U.S. could stand to do more of that. And tell us a little, Thomas, of what you're seeing in Europe because of the war and how it's changed how people think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it is very interesting. And obviously there is a growing anxiety here in Europe stemming from that war. And even in some countries, especially the non-NATO countries, you see it's even growing of an anxiety that people are really starting to be preppers or whatever. I mean, they are really anticipating the worst, and we have to admit that is a problem. But other than that, I mean, we already saw from the pandemic and the ability to produce vaccines that this was the first start of having this talk that the worldwide economy, the way it's been distributed, is actually making the economy kind of a power tool. And we saw that now even more accentuated with the current crisis in Ukraine and the war. And yeah, what I mentioned in our discussions before we started this panel was that we saw that we had a discussion of delivering even more gas from Russia over 10 years here in Europe. And it was kind of seen as an important step to create the energy transition. And now in 14 days, we were able to end that discussion. We will not get any more gas. We are building now a different infrastructure. And it's interesting to see how this change overnight basically also made a whole change in the perception of how is it that we're going to deliver the green energy transition from a political level. And now people are basically struggling to see how are we able to deliver this? What will it mean? And people are even saying yeah, we might actually see that it is a necessity. We were discussing security of supply before, but it could be a necessity that we maybe even lower the economy for a period of 2-3 years to be able to actually get the green energy transition going before we can get back in the front seat of this. So very interesting and very different things to hear from the politicians from Europe, at least.
Yeah. Alex, you have a comment?
No, I mean, I'll just echo, I think there's a missed opportunity, Jonathan, to your point, to understand the Ukraine conflict in the US beyond just a sort of, let's call it NATO issue, and understand the longer term energy implications, which I think are much better understood in Europe right now and not well considered in the US. And, you know, again, if there was deeper thinking and appreciation for this topic, I think the US might be a little bit further along on its renewable energy plan.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, you know, what has made the U.S. such an economic powerhouse is that, you know, it's an engine for innovation. The country really it protects small business and it incents it to innovate. And I think that there's a tremendous opportunity to lead the world in this innovation. And I see we've got a question here, and it sort of dovetails with the second point of the question, which was, what are the greatest challenges that we see to transitioning? And one of our questions is, how are rare metals now being impacted by China and Russia? How is that going to impact the industry going forward? Are we changing? Are we exchanging one enemy for another, or what? Are we fighting with one nation state and trading it to fight with another? That's a great question. I know that from a person that's out in the market buying hundreds of millions of dollars of supply every year for these things, we've seen a tremendous inflation in prices driven by a whole host of things. Certainly, the raw material price is a driver. Shipping. The inflation in shipping has the cost to send a container from China to the US is 3 to 6 times what it was pre-pandemic. That's crazy. The cost for polysilicon has tripled. And then you add to that a tariff regime in this country that does not follow what's being said by the administration and their desire for renewables. So there is a really big mix-up in this country. And I'll hand it over to you, Thomas. What do you see as being the big challenges, and how big a challenge do you see the raw materials piece being?
Oh, this is a huge challenge, and obviously even more so if you also discuss nuclear. But I'll start out with saying that the energy industry has always been a long-term investment. It has been 30, 40, 50 years perspective. And unfortunately, it harmonizes a little more poorly maybe with the American model you just described before than the Chinese model. And the Chinese, they saw this 25 years ago, and they started investing heavily, basically in everything that they could think of. They did that analysis, right? As you were saying before, over time, there'll be no more fossil fuel. We need basically to develop and ensure that we can deliver energy. It's one thing. We need also to have the rare minerals, the rare metals. They started investing in Africa, everywhere, here where I'm from in Denmark, in Greenland. So we see that everywhere. And they have this long-term kind of perspective on it. It was, of course, state subsidized, everything. You can't really compete with that, but it's very interesting to see. And I think, unfortunately, that this might be the next power struggle that we'll see in the world, because the ownership of these minerals will definitely become the magnet of being able to do something and have power in the world. So yeah, I'm a bit worried about that, I must admit.
Yeah, and Alex, you had some ideas here when we were talking before the panel started.
Maybe I am naive and overly optimistic, but I view the rare metals issue, the spike in price of nickel, for example, with Russia. I worry about that in the short term, but a lot less so in the long term. And partly because I think the battery economy is a lot more, for lack of a better word, modular than oil and gas. So, and when I say modular, one is battery chemistries, right? LFP is a battery form factor that requires, doesn't have that dependence on nickel. And so there's a lot of folks who are saying, okay, as I look at my battery chemistry composition, how do I wean myself off of nickel and get to LFP? So that's one issue, which is like the battery itself is modular and that you can change the chemistry. Right. The second is mining and processing. We have huge opportunities that we haven't tapped into yet that could be quite valuable. An example is in California, we have something called the Salton Sea, could be one of the largest sustainably sourced lithium opportunities in the world, and just getting that moving forward. So it'll take time for that to play out into commercial existence.
And then there's not 150 years of exploration for these minerals. The market for these minerals is 20 years old.
Yeah, yeah. And then the third, which again, the reason why I'm sort of cautious in the short term but optimistic in the long term is you can recycle batteries. You can't do that with oil and gas. And so the ability to develop that circular economy will give us that resilience as well against okay, somebody shuts off your supply of batteries. Well, as geopolitical tensions rise, your answer is great. I've got diverse chemistry types that I produce in this country. I've got metals and mining processing capabilities, and I have recycling capabilities. That's my shock absorber in a way that was not possible so easily in the oil and gas scenario, although shale in the US provided some sort of cognate.
That's right. And I think, you brought up another really good point, which is that the technology is growing almost on a Moore's law projected. And I think that, like you said, if there's a shortage of one thing, then science will take us in a different direction. You mentioned lithium iron phosphate over lithium ion, which has a host of benefits, one of which being that it doesn't burn, it doesn't run away like lithium ion does, or MCD would be that chemistry. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that there are probably sources of those minerals in safer places too than where we're getting oil and gas today. And the recycling component is one that I haven't even considered and is hugely valuable. So I think you've got the opportunity for multiple chemistries, like you said, and it's there are a lot of places that are a whole lot friendlier, like Peru, than Iran to get, or Russia for nickel. Where we will find that sourcing these materials it can be done in a little bit more responsible and sort of politically responsible way. So I think we touched on that a little bit. I think battery is going to be a really and storage is going to be a fundamental part here in the United States. I think there's no question that the transition to renewables in a meaningful way can't be done in this country with storage. Thomas, how are you seeing that occur in EU countries? Are you seeing the sort of penetration on the storage side that we're getting ready to see here in the US?
No, storage is definitely huge, and luckily, as you're saying, we see different technologies that are coming. Also, LHD obviously being very important for everything related to transportation. So I see that what will happen, the traditional battery technology when it comes to electricity actually might be in many places exchanged with a kind of power to X, and that is probably the hot topic in Europe right now. A lot of the research is focusing on power to X. A lot of the research is trying to understand how can we make this transition possible within urban areas, rural areas. So I do see that there is a lot of things going on, trying to understand the mechanisms, and also trying probably to see that there will not be one solution for all. we probably did that mistake 15 years ago here in Europe, where we thought, okay, we'll produce all the wind electricity in the north, all the solar in the south, and then the Germans will be able to consume it all. And we thought that was kind of the way that we would produce everything. It didn't happen. We were not able to make that power system work, and now we are probably seeing it much more fragmented. But it's also a strength, and it's back to what you said before, Jonathan, that it actually gives the opportunity for a lot of small startups to come out there and give their product and make it work in a communities is probably also one of the most important topics that we see now. It's very much customer driven. People really want the transition to take place. They take a lot of initiatives themselves. So they want to go fossil free within a small community, and they invest, they do a lot of work. So that is what is happening in Europe now. And I see very positively on this, definitely.
Terrific. I think in dovetailing with that, one of the questions I have here is, beyond innovative technology and solutions, what about the power of partnerships? What kind of strategic or cross-sector or cross-border partnerships might help generate success in this area? I think that's a great question, and one that I'll give to you, Thomas, and Alex, and I have a couple of thoughts myself.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And coming from the behavioral science myself, I probably take my starting point there and say that understanding the social economic factors of the energy transition, how can you motivate, make a legislation that basically supports this growing of the communities, of adopting new technologies, ensuring that we are not just focusing on making the existing infrastructure work, but that we're also allowing for. So I'd say that creating a more holistic view on what it takes to create the energy transition is super important. And as I said, coming from a behavioral scientific point of view, understanding what motivates people to take action is one of the things that I see can really make a big change, because it can also push for the politicians to take action afterwards.
Yeah. Alex?
I think one of the most successful things I see that we can always do more of is sort of, as somebody who works at an incubator, I see startups pitching a lot.
Right.
Oh, good. What I see less of is what I call that reverse pitch, which is he or she who owns the problem, whether it be the utility, the state energy authority, sort of saying, this is my problem, and whoever can solve this, I will award a prize to, or whatever.
Right.
And there's, the DOE is doing some cool stuff on this, but I think that's in some ways, that's sort of like he or she who owns the problem, sort of publicizing it and saying, I will pay money in some form or factor to he or she can solve this problem, is a really great way to marshal resources, because you give a very clear marching order then to the startup community who says, oh, I might be able to work on that. So I think, especially, whether it's public sector utilities, there's an opportunity to do more of that reverse pitch of like, these are very clear pain points and I need them solved, and I will pay in some fashion for he or she who can solve them for me, or part of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that sort of dovetails well with sort of how do we see what's coming out of Israel and Hebrew University more in particular, where there are opportunities for cross-border partnership. I would only add that, this is sort of like sending man to the moon. It's certainly not as, it's not a US problem in that sense, but it is a scientific problem for which there is an answer, and for which academia will play an extraordinarily important part in being the seed for all this innovation that eventually becomes the new energy economy. As is mentioned by some one of the comments here is that renewable energy or storage in particular only represents 2.3%, or will only represent 2.3% of the energy in the system. I think that number actually will be higher, but I think what it represents is the size of the opportunity. And we're talking about an opportunity here that is on a global basis hundreds of trillions of dollars, and in the US worth tens of trillions of dollars. It's hard to fathom trillions, quite frankly. But that truly is the size of the opportunity here. And the cost of not doing this is probably far greater. So, I think that there is a tremendous opportunity on the science side of this to work in partnership with U.S. universities and U.S. Labs like Department of Energy and internationally with the EU. This is a solution that's not going to come from one place.
Jonathan,
Maybe just to add to that, yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. No, I was just thinking that, for example, when we are looking at the EV infrastructure, one interesting concept that came out of Israel actually some years ago was exchanging the battery instead of charging your car with an existing battery in it. It never really succeeded, maybe because there was unfortunately too much IPR in relation to the car manufacturing industry. They didn't want to go for like a standard, so you can easily go in and just exchange that battery. But I mean, looking at it from a broader and more holistic perspective, the end customer, we would not have these problems of, oh, I will not buy an EV because it'll take me an hour to charge it. We'll not have a problem of endless queuing because it takes forever again and building all this. No, you will actually be able to basically replace the existing petrol stations with battery exchanging facilities. And in that respect, it is interesting that you're not necessarily looking at this, unfortunately, from this more holistic perspective. What does it take to make this work? Now we are unfortunately setting it step by step instead of trying to look at it. How can we solve, as you were saying before, the real big problems that we are trying to solve here?
And Alex?
And then, Jonathan, I was just going to say, to the topic of Israel, one of the things where I think I work at a place-based clean tech incubator, so we think a lot about a regional ecosystem, the strengths and weaknesses, and how to take advantage of that. One of the things that strikes me about Israel is the competency in water technology, and what I'm becoming to appreciate over the last 5-6 years is the degree to which sort of that water energy nexus is yielding new business opportunities. Israel has a very long-standing competency in water technologies. It's an incredibly water-stressed region of the world. I'm now seeing a lot of business opportunities that are at the water energy nexus where there's a real critical role to play. An example is we have a company in our portfolio that does extraction of minerals from brackish water or ocean desal. Now, ocean desal doesn't happen to be a big deal in California, but brackish water treatment is. You look at Middle East, and ocean desal is a big opportunity. So, leveraging some of that water technology capability and leaning into some of the emerging energy solutions challenges, right, where we need to find more opportunities for sustainable mineral extraction.
That's something I hadn't even thought of. In your, it's the largest mineral sink on the earth is in the oceans. Right. So you're absolutely right, and something I hadn't considered. And in the U.S. is in the Western U.S. They are having a bit of a water problem, and I don't think that that's getting any better any soon.
No, it's not getting any better.
We played a role in a project in San Diego that is the largest desal, I think maybe the largest RO facility in the world, but one of the larger desal facilities in the world, 100 million gallon a day reverse osmosis. So they're doing it in California today. It is so it is not widespread, but the scarcity of water is a real problem for humanity.
Yeah.
That's a great point. So I think we're sort of coming to the end of our time today, but one of the questions I wanted to pose to all of you is sort of a forecast for the future. Where do you think the energy economy will be and renewable energy 10 years from today? Tom?
Yeah, no, I do not think 10 years is that long of a time. I easily remember 10 years back, and at that time we kind of thought that we would have solved everything right now, and we haven't. So, but I think to be also optimistic that what we'll see is that we have actually found suitable business models for more decentralized renewable solutions. We've been able to create also more flexibility. We probably see a lot of different ways. I'm very much looking forward to the development, as I said before, on community level. So I see people taking action becoming a very important part. All you're saying about incubators, new startups will become super important because we need those people with new ideas, and hopefully then there will be politicians on the other side that are willing to listen to both the people and all the people with the innovative ideas. So yeah, my prediction is that we will have come a small step forward, not that far as we might hope for, but that there will be a light at the end of the tunnel with much more renewable electricity taking part in community-led and innovative solutions across Europe and also in Africa and Asia and in the US.
Alex?
I sort of have a yes and to what Thomas said, which is I think historically, when we thought about energy systems, at least the electron part of the energy system, not necessarily the oil and gas part, the utility played a key role, if not the predominant role. And I don't think that role is necessarily going to go away, but I do think it gets weaker over time as corporates and individuals take a much more centralized role in the energy system. In two ways, at least. One is we're still beginning to tap into the ways in which business models, whatever, allow individuals, whether they be corporates or consumers, to manage, to generate their own energy, right? Whether it's on-site solar, whatever else it is, distributed energy resources, whatever else. And two, linked to that, just the proliferation still that's needed of real-time energy information for consumers and corporates to make better decisions on the margin. I still find it baffling that I don't get sort of, per minute information from my utility accessible on my smartphone about, oh, you're using excess energy, and we happen to be having a drought of available renewable. Would you mind, turning down your heat pump HVAC, whatever it is. I think we're still just beginning that transition of the recipient of the energy being more
having a say.
Yeah, having a say.
And I would only echo that it surprised me that how our regulated utilities have been so deaf to the desires of their customer, and that it's taken large corporates and the substantial buying capacity that they have to move the needle. I mean, that's really surprised me. You'd think that they'd be more attuned to their customer.
The downside of that I do worry about is sort of the stranded assets problem. Utilities have an obligation, at least in many countries, to serve, that we talked about how did electricity happen in the US? It was this, monopoly that allowed the rural parts of the country to be subsidized, if you will, by creating electricity. We have this notion now of corporates in the US at least saying, I want to procure my electricity directly. I want to be 100% green, sort of reducing on the margin who the utility serves, where they go, great, I'm just stuck serving,
right,
much smaller.
I mean, you're hitting on their fundamental core point, which is a backlog of legacy assets for which they have tremendous debt, and there is no simple solution that is economic to their retirement. And that's not to say that I'm not a believer in an all of the above mix. I think nuclear plays a role. I think gas plays a role. I think coal needs to go away in a major fashion, but will always exist in some smaller component of the energy mix. But I mean, you make a very good point, and that is, as they say, is the rub for why you're not seeing a little bit more adoption. They're sort of got their back against the wall, and it's taken big corporate customers that have the power of the checkbook to sway them. I would add that, or my sort of prognostication of where we are in 10 years is, as you mentioned, far greater domestic sourcing of materials, the raw materials that go into battery and into panels. I think I would hope that this administration is successful in incenting the construction of domestic manufacturing of storage and wind and solar. And I would hope that we're out of this political morass, although nothing would suggest that that will be the case. All roads lead to it being worse rather than better. But that to me is perhaps the biggest speed bump at this point, is that it's not seen as a common enemy of the nation that needs a solution. And I'll open it up now if there are any questions. I see we have a question here for the group, and it is, how can philanthropy play a role in all this? Is there anything we can do from a funding philanthropy angle to help in this area? And that's a great question. Go ahead, Alex.
So we're a nonprofit, right? So we are funded from government, from corporate support, but also philanthropic. And I'll share an interesting example that we're working on, which will resonate with some folks. Startups go through, in the clean tech space, often go through valleys of death, some of which are preventable when they say, gosh, I have a customer contract. I have this utility says they want to do a pilot with me, and they say, they'll pay me back in 9 months, but I don't have the cash up front to get this pilot started. And so we run a debt fund. We're helping our start. We factor those loans. We say, okay, you're going to be paid back by this utility in 9 months. We're hands-on with you. We know you're good for it. We'll give you that loan to do the work, which is, I would argue, a better use of funding than equity, because the project itself at that point has fairly little risk.
Right.
But there's no one serving that market because it's not particularly lucrative, but it's vital to helping startups scale. It's also, let's acknowledge, I think we sometimes allow startups to gorge on equity when sometimes not every startup has a venture capital ready model, but still can have huge climate impacts and clean tech impacts. So
yeah, and I would also, the typical private equity model is looking, is so focused on unicorns, these,
right,
100 or 1000x returns, and oftentimes a perfectly good business is overlooked.
Yeah, and so that debt fund that we run is financed by what's called program-related investment, which allows philanthropies to invest in a nonprofit, but expect a concessionary return, because we're generating returns, albeit not market rates, for that kind of work. And so that's an example of philanthropy seeking a risk-adjusted, return lower than the market. But we also, there's any number of amazing philanthropy-funded organizations doing incubation, doing community solar, like you name it, the number of things, real on-the-ground work to help the communities most impacted by climate change say, okay, what can we do right now in our community to generate renewable energy?
That's great. Thomas?
Maybe let me add to that then also to answer the question. I saw that Matthew Gladwell was also part of this conference, and in his book, The Tipping Point, he's pointing to the fact that we basically need some specific people to make the ball rolling. And looking into philanthropy, it's important, as that's also what I hear you saying, that we are not only looking at investing in the new technologies, but that we're actually also looking in how can we make this story, how can we make this ball rolling, how can we ensure that the good stories, exactly as you're saying. I was in India recently, just before the pandemic, obviously, visiting a lot of these high-rise buildings that wanted to invest on solar on the roof. The thing was that they had no clue on how to do it. It was bureaucracy all around them. So helping basically to create the understanding and an easy system on how can we actually make things that is already there work in local context is a huge opportunity for philanthropists, as I see it.
Yeah. And I would just add a really very basic one, which is to support those candidates for public office that see the opportunity here, and not just national public office, but local public office, and those that so much of what gets done in a state is done at a very local level. Whether it's the Public Utility Commission commissioners or even county supervisors play a pretty large role in it, and supporting those candidates that recognize the importance of this, not just from a green economy perspective, but from an energy security perspective. And with that, I'll say thank you to the panelists, and thank you to Hebrew University for giving us this opportunity, and turn it over to the folks there.